I've had my grinder for sharpening the lathe tools on a ledge next to the lathe, which has worked pretty well, but there's a bunch of wood and partially turned bowls and kind of junk in front of it, so it's kind of hard to get to. And where it is on the ledge, my new sharpening jig isn't going to really work because it sticks out behind the grinder, and the wall and the door that's behind the ledge is sort of in the way. So I've had it on my adjustable cart for a while, which doesn't really work because I want to use my cart for other things. So what I'd like to do is build a stand for the grinder. And what I've been thinking is I'll basically build a series of shelves with 4 sides wrapping those shelves. And in the front, there'll be a hole for a door so I can get to those shelves. And then a wooden top that the grinder can mount to. I have a scrap piece of Baltic birch and a full sheet of Baltic birch that I can use. So the first thing to do is to cut the height of the 4 sides into the piece of Baltic birch. And with this piece I can get the 2 short sides and the front cut. So that's what I'll cut. This is cutting the front where the door will be, and then the second side. And they go together, and I'll label which ones are which at the joints. Now for the front, I want to cut the front into 4 sides and a door. So I'll do that like this. So I'll cut the top off and the sides, and then the bottom as well. And then what that'll leave me is the door in the center. So the 4 sides will go together like this, and I can biscuit them back together again and get a nice sharp opening. Doing it this way means I don't have to cut it out with a jigsaw or something like that. That won't give me a sharp edge. So I'll re-biscuit this back together again and clamp it in place. And now it's dry, and I have a door frame. Now I'll cut the piece for the back. And what I want to do is miter the vertical joints along the 4 sides. So I'm going to angle the blade to 45 degrees and then cut the 4 joints at each corner. And once that's done, I can re-90 the blade again. And what I want to do is put dados where I want to have shelves on the inside. So I'll cut dados. And then I want to rabbet a space for the top piece to fit into. When I was putting this together, I realized I should have done this on the bottom as well because the design changed a little bit. But there's a solution for that. So these are the 4 sides laid out. And I'll lay out where I want to put biscuits. And I find I can use a long straight edge to mark the spots along the joints for the biscuits. And I can put in all the biscuits. I've pretty much given up on the bag on this biscuit joiner because it clogs too easily. And I cut some shelves to go on the inside. And then it was a matter of gluing up all of the biscuits and all of the joints really quickly because I sort of had to do it all at once. So the shelves go in, and some of the biscuits were a little tight. It was all going great until about right here where the glue bottle clogged, and I had to take the top off and kind of make a big gluey mess, but it worked in the end. And then lots and lots of clamps. You can never have too many clamps. So now it's all clamped up, and the joints seem to all be nice and tight, so that's good. So this is why you should check your glue bottle before you start a big gluing job. That's a big blob of dried glue that was inside the tip, the glue bottle. Now the piece is dry, so I can take the clamps off, and I can glue the top in place. And that just drops into the rabbet that was in the top. And I'll just put that in with some brads. Now to make the cap piece, I have a scrap piece of fur left over from the Jelly Studio project. So I can joint that on the face and the edge, and then run it through the planer to get it to the same thickness, and cut it in half. The board wasn't quite wide enough to cover the top, so I have to glue it into a wider piece. So I'll use some biscuits, mostly just to help align the joint, not so much for strength. And that goes together. Now I can clamp that and wipe the glue off. Now that's dry. I can take the clamps off. I want to cut it down to size now, so I'll joint one edge, and I can run it through the table saw, and then cut it to length. I want to have the joint in the center. And then to do the edge, what I ended up doing with this piece was to make it the same size as the base, so it wouldn't overhang the top. I didn't want a piece of trim around the edge either, so what I did is I made a little rabbet around the bottom of the cap piece, which will give me a little reveal right where there would normally be a piece of trim. So the little void of the reveal will act like a piece of trim, so the cap and the base don't have to line up perfectly. And then some sanding, and I'll put the finish on at this point. So it's just polyurethane. Now for the hinge on the door, what I'm going to do is a piano hinge. And the hinge I got was just a little bit too long, so I cut it down. And then I can attach that to the door and to the cabinet. And what I did was to put 2 screws on each side and make sure everything lined up and the door fell in the right spot. And then once that was aligned, I could then put in the rest of the screws. I had wanted to do sort of a base on the bottom, but I decided because this was coming out so clean as a form, I didn't really want a base at the bottom. I put a bottom piece inside the frame of the cabinet. So I needed some blocking to attach that bottom piece to. And while I was in there, I put some blocking in for a shelf that'll go just under the door. This is making the shelf piece that's going to go just under the door. And you can see how that shelf's going to go in. It's going to be something that I can pull out if I need to. And then this is the bottom going in. And I just put it in with screws. I got these little leveling feet that I thought were going to go on the base piece that I was going to make, but they ended up just going on the sides of the cabinet. So I'm not sure how much I like them just sitting on the outside of the cabinet. They seem to work really well. The cabinet is really steady. I wanted to find the center of the top so I could find where the holes for the bolts for the grinder would go into the top piece. And then I'll drill the holes for the bolts that'll hold the grinder in place. And put the grinder back on again over the holes. And then I realized I wanted to put the jig in place, and I needed to do that before the grinder got bolted down. But I needed to know where the grinder would go so the jig will fall right under the grinding wheel. I attached the jig, and I drilled the holes for the grinder bolts all the way through into the cabinet. So the bolts will hold both the grinder and the cap piece onto the top of the cabinet. This will let the wood of the cap piece expand and contract because the bolts will just be in the center. Now for the handle on the door, I had cut a section of wood when I was working on the other cabinets for the lathe area, and I had some of that left over. So I cut off a little section of that to make the handle. I figured the handle could go right in the corner of the door. And I wanted to put a little magnetic latch inside the cabinet to hold the door shut. So I screwed that into the inside of the cabinet, which I really should have done before I glued everything up, but I have to do it now. Then I need to find where to put a little screw on the back side of the door that'll fall where the magnet is and help hold the door closed. And that's how the door closes. It stays shut. And then we can put the grinder into place and clean up the lathe area a little bit. In the bottom, I wanted to put a bunch of drain rock that I had left over just as weight to kind of hold the cabinet down. So you can see why that shelf needs to be removable. And then I can put all of my sharpening things on the shelves, which is kind of nice to have that all in one place now. I got the light working, and there it is. I should talk about sharpening now. So I find that I turn mostly with the bowl gouge and the scraper. It's probably 90% of the time that's what I'm using. So I thought I'd set the grinder up with the same fine grit wheel on each side, and then set one side up for the bowl gouge and then one side up for the scraper. At some point in the recent past, someone asked me about talking about how I sharpen the tools, and this seemed like a good point to talk about that. And I think what I found, what I like to do is to actually do a grind probably once or twice during a project. And then in between that, I'll freshen up the edge with a little diamond card. And that'll happen every minute or so, every 2 or 3 minutes maybe. So it's all about sharpening a little bit often. What I've learned with this is that to use something like this, it's really simple. You just touch the card to the back edge of the grind on the tool, and you roll it over to the edge, and then you can sharpen, or basically grind by hand that edge. But the thing that's important is to not let the card come up from the back edge, because then you're just rolling your tip over and you're just dulling the tool. So to get a nice sharp edge, you want to keep it where it's grinding the back and the front edge of the grind at the same time. What's nice about using a jig like this isn't so much that it gives you a better edge. For years I just did this by hand, and it turned just fine. But what's nice about using a jig is it gives you the same shaped grind every time, so the tool behaves the same way as you're turning every time. It doesn't change because you're freehanding the shape of the grind every time. So that's what's nice about having a jig. And you can totally make one of these. It does exactly the same thing. I was just lazy and went and bought one. Thanks for watching.